And so again, a little bit about myself. I am a PhD candidate in marine sciences. I'm working in a quantitative fisheries ecology lab. And that's really just a lot of words to say that I like to use emerging quantitative methods. So new analyses or techniques. And I use those to explore shifts in community composition within our global marine ecosystems. And so my day-to-day looks like I spend a lot of time coding. I spend a lot of time seeking help online for that coding, and I spend a lot of time reading. And so most of my lab group uses data sets that span decades in order to further our understanding of marine communities. And so a huge part of why I feel so strongly about OpenScapes is that I was onboarded to this lab that uses lots of data entirely in the pandemic. And I was so lost working with these huge data sets that I didn't make or collect. And I felt so frustrated by the huge chunks of time that I had to spend navigating the best practices and ways to productively go through and use the data that I was given. And a huge part of that was that I couldn't knock on the door of someone next door to get an explanation, or I couldn't, grab an older grad student in passing and ask them how to structure this data. And so much of my time was spent learning the unsaid and the undocumented. And it was spent sending emails or trying to track down who wrote the original code. And what's most important is that we cannot depend on those types of tactics if we want our work to be inclusive and reproducible. So this slide deck is called Data Strategies for Future Us. And I learned how much successful working time can be lost in the way that we structure our data and why. So data strategies for future us, whether it's you in 5 years trying to reopen a file that you haven't touched in a while, or a new postdoc or undergrad, or even the public that you're trying to share your work with, we have to be able to understand and move forward. And that begins with our data strategies. And so this is one of my favorite lectures to watch, to do. I've seen it so many times, and I still think I can't hear enough how to organize my data effectively. So I hope that even if you joined us last year and heard this before, that it can still be really beneficial to all of you. And so with that, here's an outline of what we'll be going through in this presentation. We'll be talking about data management strategies, and I'll introduce a very specific data analysis strategy, data organization in tidy data, and we'll define these words so all of us walk away having an understanding of what they mean. So first here we have data organization and spreadsheets. And so we reference a paper that was written by Broman and Wu, and it was published in 2018. And it outlines how we can all make our spreadsheets more efficient, less clunky, and more accessible. And I think that one of the greatest misconceptions anyone can have about their data is that it doesn't matter how it's set up. And I'm positive that every single one of you can relate to the feeling of just true regret when you open up a document or a spreadsheet and you have no idea what's going on. If you're lucky, right, it'll come to you and you'll remember what you meant by variable 3, or whether your data set days were month day or day month. But if you're unlucky and you can't remember your workflow or how you structure your data, then you can hold back important research progress. You can hinder your team's effectiveness to work together and onboard new people, and you can waste a lot of time. And with that, you can waste quite a bit of money as well. And so much of this can be avoided at the very beginning by structuring our data and spreadsheets efficiently. So I encourage you to go over the materials that are here in your own time, but we're also going to outline quite a few of the practical tips that they've shared and the basic principles for data organization. And so with that, some of the basic principles that they share in that work, I believe that data organization is not inherently difficult. But what is really difficult, something that I often very much struggle with, is having the forethought to adapt these basic principles to your workflow early on, so you don't run into a spreadsheet horror story down the line. And so now I'm going to outline and go through some of these suggestions and principles and how you can apply them to your own work. Whether you have a new data set that you're going to be using, or say you go into an internship this summer, you can be consistent and really apply these basic principles to the data that you work with. And so the first is to be consistent. So whether it's codes for categorical variables, subject identifiers, a file name, the layout of the files, consistency is one of the greatest gifts you can give your future self and also your collaborators. An example of a way you can be consistent across the board in your work is to use this year, month, day format in all of the work that you do. It's a standardized format that translates across different audiences and regions as well. The next tip is to not leave any cells empty, or and to only put one thing in each cell. And so one way to address that is to make sure that you use a common and consistent code for missing data. It's important within your work to make clear that data are known to be missing versus intentionally left blank. And another important tip of putting just one thing in each cell is to treat each of your cells as an individual component of the data that you want to save. So for example, if you have 2 study sites and this is your 3rd replicate of the sampling, instead of putting site 2_3 and having both of those details in one cell, you can create a column for the site and a column for the replicate. And this tiny bit of data wrangling can save you an incredible amount of time in the future. And so I won't go through each of these individually, but I will touch on quite a few of the other basic principles, one being to create a data dictionary. This is also defined as metadata in some cases. It's a separate file to explain what all of your variables are, what are the actual measurements or the units of the variables that are in your cells, all of the data about your data that sometimes feels like you already know all of it, but one day you might not remember that, or your collaborator may not remember that. And so it's important to have this data about your data available to use and to reference back to. Another important tip, one that I absolutely live by now, is to not include any calculations in your raw data file. You leave your raw data file raw. This means no calculations, no graphs. Your data file should be pristine. And the reason for that is that every time you open that data file, you're grabbing some of the data to make a quick figure, or you're trying to just make a quick calculation. Every time you do that, there's an opportunity to introduce error into your data file, and you want to avoid that at any means possible. Additional tools and principles to follow in your workflow is to make plenty of backups, multiple locations, multiple backups. Corruption of the files is very possible. A broken computer is possible. A lost password is possible. It is one of the worst feelings to lose valuable work without backups. And so this is certainly a principle I recommend. And in doing so, you can use tools like version control softwares. One that most folks are familiar with, for example, would be like Google Docs, where it's keeping track of your edits in different versions, and you can even restore previous versions that you want to come back to. Same for Google Sheets, for example, or using tools like GitHub, where you're able to post and reproduce and share your code collaboratively in the different iterations of it. The next tool is to use data validation to avoid data entry errors. So this can be extremely helpful as we're hoping that human error doesn't creep into the work that we're doing. And so, for example, in Excel, you can use data validation and insert a number range or possible values to help you to catch errors. So if I say that I'm inserting numbers between 1 and 10, and I accidentally type 2 3s, it would bounce back and let me know that I've made an error instead of accidentally letting that really high value exist in my data set. And so these are just some basic principles that we recommend implementing into your work as you start to produce spreadsheets and organization of your data. And the next is thinking about spreadsheet drama. There can certainly be a lot of woes that come with producing spreadsheets that you want to use for an analysis. This is a podcast episode where they talk about the power and woes of using Excel. It also talks about, and something that we'll talk a little bit about here as well, the power and importance of separating your analysis and its steps into documented different pieces. And so I'll delve into that further as well. It also talks about the development of the tidyverse, which we're going to spend a good bit of time talking about at the end of this presentation. And so after you make your beautiful spreadsheet, your next step is likely to do some computing. And so here we're talking about good enough practices for scientific computing. For example, if you want to plug it into a software like R, for example, where you want to manipulate or visualize those data. And the goal of making sure that you have good enough practices for scientific computing is to make sure that it has human and machine readability and accessibility. The data and the organization of those data is what you want to see as an individual, and then also what your computer wants to see too. And so we're going to dive deeper into outlining these practices. But for example, if you have a manuscript that you're working on with other people, a thoughtful workflow can include the ability to track changes, edits, and iterations of the manuscript to avoid error and to track development. And so we talked about, once again, ensuring that that raw data is well organized, it's documented, it's backed up. And now it's time to apply that same principle to your analysis as well. So once you have data that is accessible and ready to work with, it's imperative that your thought process and the analysis development are well documented as well. And the reason for that is it's important for replication and also for inquiries. If people or even yourself can't remember or understand your workflow, then how can it be replicated? How can it be built upon? How can it be improved? And so the goal of documenting how you come to the decisions you make in your analysis is important for, going through your own thought process and having documentation of that for both yourself and for others. And so all of this is really important as we think about and work towards working more collaboratively and openly. And so this can include writing scripts for each stage of your analysis. They can be separate so that they're well organized, but also it's important to include explanatory notes at the top of your scripts. So this is an opportunity to remind yourself why you're here, how you started to do it, and it's an opportunity to really make sure that the relevant information you need or that your collaborators may need to process these data or to run your analysis is all there. And so for 6 and 7 here, anticipating your data and analysis needs and standardizing as much as possible. This is an opportunity if you're making a whole bunch of graphs, for example. How can I create a standardized version of all of these figures so that it's easier for myself and my collaborators and for the public or for people to interact with my work? And lastly is to make your data more accessible. So your data can, and sometimes is, more valuable and useful to others than just your analysis or published results. And so this means that anyone should be able to take a look at your data and the metadata, that data dictionary that you created, and have a picture of what's going on. And these are tools that make it possible to produce reproducible data for other people to use, and also reproducible analyses that push forward and propel our research. And so we're going to further delve into the definition of tidy data itself, but the premise of tidy data is to deliberately think about the shape and the structure of your data. And it's important to note that in this sense, the act of data wrangling itself and tidying up your data is intentional and it's well documented. You're noting how you want to change it so that you leave your raw data file raw and you produce a separate analysis of how you tidy that data. And so that may sound very intimidating, but we have a number of resources shared in this slideshow. We're happy to talk about it more as well. That can assist you on this journey of producing tidy data that's more effective for your analysis and for sharing. And I wanted to note this statistic in the corner, which is that 50 to 80% of data scientists' time is spent wrangling data. And I relate to this statistic a lot because when data isn't organized well, or there's a lot unsaid or unwritten, it can take an incredible amount of time to understand what you're working with. And these tools are an opportunity to reduce that time and spend it on our science instead. And so tidy data, to define it, it first has a standard and it has a structure and meaning of the data set that are very intentional. So here we have an example of tidy data. Each variable forms a column. Each variable forms a column. Each observation is in a single row, and each cell is a single measurement. And what's important is that when you organize and implement this structure into your data, you can see how a more standardized approach can be used to understand the structure of the data set, as opposed to, like it says here, each data set is uniquely messy, And as such, it requires time and energy, and in most cases, prior knowledge and understanding that may inhibit the accessibility and analysis readiness of the data set that you're producing. And so to this point, if your data is tidy, you're able to increase your efficiency by using these pre-assembled tools to help manage your data, as opposed to having to start from scratch, wrangling your data. So what does this mean for you? If your data is tidy, you can get to your research and analysis quicker. So can all of your collaborators. And you have a toolbox to know and apply data wrangling across different data sets. And so this makes your data organization and management more predictable, more consistent, and it requires less time and adjustment overall for everyone. Your data is also easier to update. It's easier to understand, and it's easier to reuse, which can give you the opportunity to integrate new tools and techniques for a more powerful workflow and more powerful deliverables. And so there are a number of tools that exist to help you with tidy data. Yes, everyone ideally wants tidy data, but that can be a lot. And you may not know where to start in learning all of that. And you don't need to, because there are so many cool threads, functions, packages that have been produced to help you, to help us understand and apply tidy data skills. And so these are just a few of the incredible tools and resources that exist to help you propel your tidy data forward, or to reorganize data that you have already that you'd like to be tidy, so you can use the powerful tools that exist online to process and manipulate your data as well. And so all of this is hoping that if you apply tidy data to your work, you can transfer this confidence to other data sets that you might work with too. And so hopefully after today, you'll want to make a friend in tidy data. And we also have some more resources that are available to you all if you'd like to take a look in these slides. Again, these are linked in our agenda document for you to take a look at. And additionally, we have a slide deck that is linked here that's all about metadata if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that data dictionary that we mentioned earlier.